All right, I'd like to welcome Adjunct Professor of History at John Jay College, Professor Milton Allimadi. He is the founder of Black Star News, and he is also the host of African History Club. Become a Patreon to that. I am. And he's going to talk to us about Burkina Faso
Yes.
and also Thomas Sankara, which is one of the most important uh, just revolutionary figures in general in the world, especially in the 20th century. So to begin this, I want to give some sort of historical context. Is that cool?
Yes, of course.
So before it was Burkina Faso, it was the Republic of the Upper Volta, right?
Correct.
And then before that, it was the French Upper Volta. So take us through that sort of early history briefly, the role of French colonialism and stuff like that.
Okay, very good. First of all, thanks for hosting me on your show.
Absolutely.
I don't think we can understand Burkina Faso or Upper Volta in isolation, because once we connect the history, then we understand the present, not only of Upper Volta, Burkina Faso, but of the entire African continent. The African continent was formerly partitioned amongst the European powers in 1884. They had a conference in Berlin, Germany, called the Berlin Conference, November 1884 to February 1885. So you had the French there, you had the British, the notorious imperial powers. The Portuguese were there, Spain, Germany, of course, the host, Italy, Belgium. So the French apportioned for themselves huge slices in West Africa and parts of North Africa as well. The British, some parts of West Africa, countries that are now modern nations of Ghana, for example, Nigeria, those were British colonies. And in East Africa, you have Uganda, Kenya, and the British inherited what was Tanganyika after Germany was defeated in World War. And then it became a quote unquote UN trustee, but in essence, a British colony. And why did they do this? Because they didn't want to fight amongst themselves. So they said, if we're going to do any fighting, any exploitation, let's exploit the Africans, right? So they set out and they brought boots in the ground. They set up the colonial regimes and administrations throughout Africa. They exploited African labor. They exploited African resources. So in other words, the entire continent became like a plantation, a European plantation. And the way to see colonization is um, the successor of plantation slavery in the so-called New World after the abolition of the slavery regime. They just simply transformed it into colonialism in Africa and, of course, in other parts of the world. And that's how the people that now live in what we know as Burkina Faso came into contact with the French. Obviously, they were part of a larger French region of colonial control in West Africa. So if you look at what happened in 1884 to seize chunks of territory in Africa and then use that as a source of cheap labor, of resource plunder, minerals, whether they're metals, whether they're natural resources, timber, gold, diamond, and then at a later stage, even uranium. So each African colony was providing different products to the various European colonial powers. That was 1884. So let's fast forward to today in the 21st century. The arrangement is still absolutely the same.
Correct.
So the same African countries still provide. And I've left out one other um, part. They became consumers of the products that were being manufactured in the factories in Europe using the resources from Africa. And then, of course, the products were plundered or at less than survival income. And the products they bought, the manufactured products, were at highly inflated prices. And that was the relationship. And that explains why the countries that became industrialized and became wealthy continued to grow wealthier, and the countries that were exploited continued to become, in fact, that's where the term immiserization comes in. Things got actually worse progressively, not only in relative terms, but even in absolute terms. And that is precisely what the conditions are today. That is the relationship that exists in the 21st century, not only between Burkina Faso and France and the industrialized world, but the entire African continent and the industrialized world. So once you see that broad picture that affects all those African countries, then you understand when you see any incident or events going on in Burkina Faso, you can understand when you see something similar happening in a different African country. What was unique about Thomas Sankara was that he tried to break out of that relationship. Most African leaders know what to do to break from that relationship, but they know it comes at a high cost, and that is why very few of them dare to challenge the system.
Right, right. And we'll I want to get to some of those specifics of rejecting foreign influence, but before we get there, um, as I understand it, Sankara was radicalized by some workers and laborers in Madagascar, right? That
Even
were
before that,
even before
he had a
that.
tutor when he was a very bright young man, and he was, his consciousness was really became evident even when he was still in what we call grade school in this country. His father was a functionary in the French colonial system um, when it was still a French colony. So he got to go to what you might say was a relatively better school compared to the other schools in the colony. And he attended school with the children of the colonial officials, so with Europeans. And he objected to the preferential treatment that they got. And he got into arguments with some of the kids. And in fact, there's a story where he got in a fight with one of the European students, and the school demanded that his father punish him in front of the entire school to humiliate him. And his father refused. And that's when he saw that, yes, it is worth fighting against injustice. And then he joined. And then initially, there was some idea that he might go into the seminary, but he opted to go into the military instead as a young cadet. And then there was a professor in the colonial system, and an African professor who was schooled in Marxist theory. And he used to come to the military academies and teach, history, geography, world history, and some economics. That's what he taught in public. But then he would identify and spot out students that he knew, were really sharp. And he would invite them to his home into a private tutoring session. So this small group would meet clandestinely in his home, and that's where he gave them instructions in uh, in Marxist economics, in socialism, and in how other parts of the world were challenging the system. The history of the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and that's where he really started gaining that different type of consciousness. And when he went to Madagascar, one of a few select students from his country sent there for specialized training. Madagascar also had a very progressive young officers in the military, and they seized power in Madagascar. And they wanted to introduce a socialist system, very progressive, against the reactionary neo-colonial regime. And that's where he studied there. And while he was there, he also studied agriculture, because obviously most African countries are agricultural based. And he wanted to study so that when he went back to his country, he could implement some of the agricultural ideas, but also the radical politics that he imbibed in Madagascar.
Awesome. Thank you for that explanation. So his rise to power was maybe in some ways non-traditional. Maybe it was a bit more common. It's non-traditional to the way that many young people are sort of in the West, especially accustomed to seeing leaders come to power. Sankara was in prison for a little bit,
Yes,
and then the coup of 1983 happened. Um, could you just and then after that, Sankara becomes the leader of
yes,
which he then renames Burkina Faso, which stands for the
absolutely.
land of upright men. Could you
Right.
just go a little bit more into depth of that whole situation?
Yes, absolutely. So when he comes back to Upper Volta, it was still Upper Volta, from Madagascar. At that time, the country was already ruled by a military leader who had deposed the, when the French left most of their colonies, just like the British, they identified some Africans who would, wear the suit and tie and essentially continue the work of the colonial regime in Africa. So that was the case also in Upper Volta. But then the military was obviously the most powerful institution in most of these countries, where the colonial regime never developed strong institutions because they never had any plans of leaving. So you don't have like a strong judiciary, you don't have a strong political structure, right? So you only have the military. So the military really, in most of those countries, exercised the true power, you know? So you had a military ruler by that time, but a military ruler who did not have the kind of consciousness that Thomas Sankara had. So when Thomas Sankara comes back, he is given the command of one of the major military training academies. And that's where he starts, radicalizing other young officers. And he starts giving them a different vision of their country. So the military regime that was there, also, of course, they're aware that this is a very smart individual. And there was a brief war between Upper Volta and Mali at that time. And he was identified as somebody who had great military leadership skills too, because he performed very well during that conflict, which was resolved diplomatically at some point. So at some point, he is actually brought into the system, into the government, and at some point, he becomes a of minister of information. But he's a very unique minister of information. He rides a bike to go to work when all these other ministers and top government officials have these, Mercedes and all these ostentatious display. And he starts setting this very different agenda that we in government should be in the service of the people. So he's like completely stands out, right? And then he tells the journalists who worked for the government media outlets that he is in charge of now, because they all report to him as minister, he says you can actually be real journalists. So if you find government officials engaging in corruption, I want you to write about it. I want you to report it on TV. I want you to talk about it on the radio. And of course, that's what journalists like doing. And they didn't believe him initially, but when they see that he's serious, they start doing it.
Right.
So even though he is serving in that same government, his fellow ministers are now reading about their involvement in shady deals and corruption.
Right.
Right? So obviously, he's not a favorite of corrupt ministers.
Right.
Right? And he had a deadline for himself. He said, I would serve, I forget, I think it was a year or a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And that at that point, I'm going to resign.
Right.
And he resigns after he attended a meeting with, the president, and he said, the deadline is here, so I'm resigning. So obviously they punish him for that. They don't like that. First of all, you're upstaging the president. And by that time, France was also, putting a lot of pressure. So he's out, and he's kind of restricted for a while, his movements. Another government's come into place, and they realize that, listen, this guy is actually a great asset. So he's brought back again as prime minister. And he goes back to the same thing he was doing, clean, efficient government, fighting and denouncing corruption. But then he starts talking about the need for Upper Volta to become independent and not to be that dependent on France and other countries. And once again, France does not like that. So he is forced out of government. And even before that, when they went to places, the prime minister with the president, who of course was his boss,
right,
he would get the most applause. And sometimes if he spoke first to warm up, and then introduce the president, after he sat down, people would start leaving, you see. So they saw this guy as a danger to the establishment, even though a great boon really to the people of Upper Volta. So once again, France demands that this guy be removed from the government, and the neo-colonial government in Upper Volta, they carry out the master's instructions, and they forced him out, and he's arrested, and some other young officers whom they knew were close to him are also arrested. But that really backfires, because then it sparks really a coup to rescue him. And the young officers that took over and launched the coup, they say, hey, you are our natural leader. And that's when he really embarks on that great experiment that he undertook from 1983 until 1987, when he was eliminated in Burkina Faso.
Wonderful. And that's sort of where this whole conversation leads to then. So I'm just going to very briefly touch on the things he did domestically, like his national vaccination push. He planted 10-20 million trees, something crazy like that. He believed in restorative ecology.
Right. Think about that. We're talking 1983, 84.
Right.
Not a lot of Western leaders in the West are even talking that talk.
Right. Yeah.
But please go ahead.
And then he outlawed forced marriages. He outlawed female mutilation.
Right.
And those were big things on the domestic front. And then on the foreign policy, that's really what made him a threat to capital.
Right. That was the third rail, so to speak.
Yeah. And it's things like rejecting foreign aid.
Yep.
Anti-debt, push for debt relief whenever he could, and did his best to avert the World Bank, to avert the IMF and all these international monetary schemes. So could you just explain his foreign policy, how that made capital feel, and how that led to his eventual assassination?
Okay, very good. And also, uh, one of the things that he was really big on domestically was, of course, empowering women. You know, and that's part of this. You mentioned banning forced marriages, but also empowered them by recruiting them into the armed forces, which was unheard of in African countries, so that they really removed that mystique as men being automatically the dominant role in, because now you have changed the name of the country to Burkina Faso. When women are trained in how to handle weapons, they conduct military drills, they become soldiers or officers in the military. It really changed the dynamics in the relation between men and women domestically. Yes, foreign policy is what really got him ultimately killed. Because his argument was this: so long as we are working and whatever surplus we generate is used to pay off the foreign debt, how are you going to break from this cycle? How is it even possible to develop and to uplift the standard of living in our country if that debt is always going to be over our head? And so he said that as a priority, but he knew that he could not do that alone. But apart from that, and I'll get back to that in a minute, he also knew the importance of identifying with other socialist leaders. So he went to, he developed a strong relationship with Cuba, of course, you know, with Castro. He developed relation with what was then the Soviet Union,
Yep.
you know, with China.
Mm-hmm.
Just because we are a former French colony, it does not mean that France is our universe,
Right.
you see? But then, obviously, none of these things would be able to change if you still have to pay essentially all of your surplus to servicing the foreign debt. And his argument was that some of the debt we inherited from the colonial era. Why should we be responsible for that in the first place? Then we had some debt incurred by corrupt regimes. And you, the lenders, you knew this was a corrupt regime. You had all the documentation and evidence, and yet you were still extending them loans. So obviously that was not for productive purpose, right? So he said, we have a strong argument to clean the slates so that we can start afresh and use any surplus we can generate really to benefit our country. And he was not just talking in theory. He had already started the practice. For example, they cut out this unnecessary food imports, which of course industrialized countries don't like that, particularly if you want the country to be a dependency. Now they're growing their own food. Within 3 years, Burkina Faso became a food surplus country, you know, self-sufficient in producing its own food. So he demonstrated that, yes, we can generate surplus, but now we need to be given a chance to use it to develop our country, to develop our healthcare system, to develop our schools, and just to raise the income level of our country. So we have to remove the debt. So he goes to this meeting of what was called the Organization of African Unity. It's a continental body for the entire continent that was launched in 1963 after a few African countries won their independence. And then, of course, later on, as more African countries won their independence, they became members. Now it's called the African Union. which supersedes the Organization of African Union, the OAU. So he goes to the OAU meeting in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and he describes this to other African leaders. He says, the only way we can really develop is to have the debt removed. All of us, it will benefit all of us. But if I make this demand alone, I will be eliminated. But they cannot assassinate 54 African leaders. They can't, which is true. They simply can't. So it's for our own protection. And there's a famous speech where he's making this, and I think people can also see it on YouTube. He speaks in French, but I think subtitles are available. He says, if I go it alone, I will not be around for the next annual meeting of the OAU next year. This was in July 1987. October 1987, he's dead. And they use his, so-called best friend, his number two in command, Blaise Compaoré, which was very shameful because they were longtime friends. They were in the academy together. They were the core of the progressive officers, like about 4 or 5 of them, principally Sankara and Compaoré, who were indoctrinating these other young officers in progressive politics and showing them how they can be a part of tremendous revolutionary change and improve the lives of their people, and also set an example of other African countries. And that is why he's seen as an icon throughout Africa and many parts of the world, even up to the end of the 21st century. So Blaise Compaoré, kills him, supported by the French, instigated by the French. I have no doubt instructed by the French. And he's just shot him and his closest associates in the most horrific manner, and the body just basically, mutilated and buried in a mass grave. It's so ironic that this is exactly the way Patrice Lumumba was also killed in the Congo when he was assassinated in 1961, when Belgian and British and American corporate imperialism decided to get rid of Congo's first democratically elected prime minister and impose Mobutu, one of the most notorious despots in Africa, in power from 1960 up to 1997. And when Lumumba was killed, he was shot by firing squad. His body was chopped up, his bones crushed, and then dissolved in sulfuric acid. It's always like the most progressive Africans who can really, elevate the consciousness of the young Africans. They are made to disappear so that people can't even go to a location as a memorial and say, this is where lies, somebody who really tried to do something for us. They don't even want that to exist.
Yeah.
And that's how they treated Lumumba's body, and that's how they treated, Sankara's body. And then Compaoré was there for 27 years, supported by the French and other agents of imperialism. And basically, he eliminated pretty much all of the successes that Sankara had instituted in terms of mass education, mass healthcare, environmentalism, and just progressive politics in his country. And that is what, the Western countries would prefer to see in African countries, because the imperial regime understands that if African countries were to unite, for example, which is something that Kwame Nkrumah advocated in the 1960s after Ghana became independent,
Yep.
then, of course, eventually, as another superpower would emerge. And we have the evidence that it can be done in relatively short time. When we look at the example of China,
Yep.
in 1959, the per capita income of Ghana was double that of China. Ghana was about $200 per head.
Wow.
China was about $89 per head. That is not a long time ago. But that's when China was just getting out of the shadows of imperial rule, when China was like the playground uh, of the West, just like Africa remains to be the playground today. So China got its act together, and whatever people say about the Chinese government, nobody can deny that they put a system that allowed them to kick out the imperial powers and start sorting through their own affairs, and most importantly, plan on the kind of economic system and production that they wanted. And that is why China is a superpower today. But when you have a continent where all of the major industries and industrial companies, mining companies, you have it, not a single one of them is an African owned company, then you see the explanation is very straightforward ahead of you. In 2012, 2013, when they had the massacre at the Marikana mines in South Africa.
Yep.
That's a British company.
Right.
Lundman, that's a British company, which is, one of the major mining companies
Yep.
in South Africa. So that's just one example. If you go to countries like Ghana that produce oil now, beginning to produce gas and gold, all the companies are foreign companies.
Yeah.
Nigeria, major oil producer. All the companies are foreign companies. In fact, Nigeria
Yeah.
does not even produce fuel. So it produces petroleum that it exports, and then it has to import fuel,
Back.
gas for the automobiles.
Yeah.
That to me is the ultimate neo-colonial relationship.
Yeah.
So I bring all these other examples just to give you an indication that, Burkina Faso is also subjected to those kind of oppressive conditions. But it just happened that in Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara emerged and he said, I am out to change this. And that's why he became a target for elimination. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, after independence, was out to change that relationship too. And that is why he was overthrown in 1966 in a coup d'etat supported by the US CIA. I already gave you the example of Patrice Lumumba. And that is the African dilemma. People know what needs to be done. It's just, there's never been an opportunity where you have more than one or two leaders willing to do the right thing at the same time. And that is what is needed, because then they won't be able to assassinate 54 leaders, just as Sankara explained.
Right. Right. Well, that was that's just perfect, because it's a great history lesson on a country that most people probably don't even know about in
Right.
America, but also it gives younger Americans an idea of the challenges Africa faces, why it's
Right.
in the place it's at compared to the rest of the world,
Right.
and maybe help develop a means of overthrowing that imperialism to.
Absolutely. I mean, he was very into young people. And, so I encourage young people to find out more about, countries like Burkina Faso. And now with social media, you can start interacting with people in Burkina Faso. And
Yeah.
one thing he encouraged also was the arts and arts festivals. Burkina Faso has one of the most renowned film festivals in the world, the
Hmm.
premier one in Africa, you know.
Yeah.
So people look that up also, the film festival in Burkina Faso.
Hmm.
And yes, just because it's a small country, it doesn't mean we cannot take lessons from that country
Right.
and from individuals that emerged from that country. After all, Cuba is a small
Cuba,
country,
just 90
and we
miles
can
away.
gain big lessons from Cuba.
Yep.
Uh, Grenada was a
Great.
very small country, but under Maurice Bishop, you know,
Yeah.
great lessons from that. And I put Sankara in the same category.
Awesome. Wonderful. Do you have anything? Would you like to plug your social media? Also, your
Oh,
Patreon
absolutely.
for
I mean,
African
people,
studies? Yep.
yes, people can, at Allimadi is my Twitter handle. Anybody that wants to have a conversation, feel free to also, reach out by email, mallimadi@gmail.com. That's MALLIMAD like David I @gmail.com. And of course, my website is blackstarnews.com. And I'm happy you announced in the beginning of the show, African History Club is my Patreon. And I encourage people to check it out too.
If you want to see a weekly version of the things we learned about Give Money to African History Club, it's great. It's a wealth of knowledge. It's very needed, especially to an English speaking audience, and we're glad you're doing that. Thank you for
Thank you.
joining us, and thank you for
Thank you
making
so much, comrade.
yeah, thank you for giving me this.
Keep up the good work, all right? Keep
Absolutely.
teaching.
Yep.
Peace and